If you look at the event description or the panel description, basically the panel should be talking about the changing transatlantic relationship, but also it kind of makes some statements which I personally don't really agree with, and I'm interested to know how the other panelists think about it, because basically the description says that the transatlantic relationship is changing because of the culture wars in America and partly because of the Make America Great movement. But I think there's a compelling kind of argument here to be made that it's a more seismic shift. I think there's one argument which you can make that actually the past 75 years of American foreign policy have been an outlier. Because they were not heeding the words of George Washington about the foreign entanglements. But also, I think you can see a shift already with Obama, with the pivot to Asia. So I think Trump is more a vehicle and kind of a face of a change, which is a more seismic shift in American public thinking, which we can open up the floor about the changing American demographic situation as well. But the real question is, do you think that this is mainly because of Trump and the MAGA movement, or there is something fundamentally different? And I think I will give the floor first to George here.
Great, thank you. And you're starting out with a great question. Obviously, President Trump gets a lot of attention in the media. He has his own unique style that does have an effect on how the United States is perceived, how our foreign policy is perceived. But I would argue in response to your question that what's fundamentally driving changes in the transatlantic relationship is not President Trump. It's not the MAGA movement. It is structural changes in the world and in the United States that would affect any president's attitude toward the transatlantic relationship. And let me briefly lay out what I think those fundamental structural changes are. First, in the geopolitical world order. Obviously, we've heard for many years that the unipolar moment is over, that period of history after the Cold War, when the United States found itself the only great power standing, and as a result, there was an enormous gap between American power and all other countries in the world combined. The United States was in a unique situation where it could essentially tell other countries what they were going to do. They could complain, but not really prevent what we're asking them to do. And that period ended, and we're now in a situation where we have one peer rival in the form of China, which is now the world's leading manufacturing power and has military capabilities that are certainly equal to those of the United States when you look at the geographic region near China, and getting more and more like U.S. capabilities elsewhere in the world as well. That is a new situation that we have to deal with, and unlike the Soviet Union, which was a military power but economically not particularly formidable, China is both a military power and an economic power. The United States has never had to deal with that kind of geopolitical challenge before, and a lot of things flow from that situation. It means that the United States has got to set priorities in the world. We can't do everything we want to do. We have to decide what's most important, what's less important, and start to rank what really matters to American national interest. And that's not something that is determined by Donald Trump's success in elections. These are forces that any president would have to deal with. And I think that has implications for the transatlantic relationship. It means that this notion of greater European burden sharing, which every American president, really since the beginning of NATO, has favored, becomes a matter of extreme urgency. The United States simply cannot continue in a situation where we are acting as Europe's military subcontractor. Europe is going to have to pull its own weight in terms of defense capabilities. But beyond that, there is a geopolitical balancing function that the United States needs Europe to play. As we move into an increasingly multipolar order, one of the imperatives that the United States faces, in my opinion, is to achieve a balance, a stability, and order within this multipolarity. Otherwise, multipolarity becomes disorderly and unstable. So for that multipolar order to have balance to it, Europe has to be one of the players in that, which means Europe needs not just to spend more money on defense, that's a part of it, but Europe has to have diplomatic weight. It needs to be a player in helping to ensure that conflicts between nations don't erupt into great power conflict, that we can manage this multipolarity in ways that remain stable. And right now, I think the reality is not only are Europe's defense capabilities lacking relative to what is necessary, but its diplomatic capabilities have atrophied quite significantly. And so that's something that the United States, I think, is looking for in this changed transatlantic relationship. It won't happen magically. I think this is one where the United States and Europe are going to have to work together, not just to develop Europe's military capabilities, but to encourage Europe to be a constructive diplomatic player in this evolving order. Now, I think the last element of all of this is political. Inside the United States, since the end of the Cold War, the United States has changed quite dramatically. We were once the world's leading manufacturing power. We are far from the world's leading manufacturing power right now. With the decline of American industry, with the decline of our productive capacity, have come changes in our society itself. The middle class, which was based in manufacturing capability, has atrophied. We've become much more of a financial power and a high technology power. That change has benefited portions of our society disproportionately, but there have been clear losers in all of that. That, in turn, I think, has driven the rise of Donald Trump, who has articulated this as being a problem, has identified this as something that has to change. And many of the problems that have flowed politically and socially from this are also problems that Europe has to deal with. What happens to a society where you've got declining birth rates, demographic pressures, and you attempt to make up for that by allowing unregulated immigration, and what kind of impact does that have on your politics and your societal relations? Those are problems that are not unique to the United States. These are problems that the alliance itself all face. We need to think through together how we're going to deal with all of these things, but they're also very politically charged. And again, I don't think it's Trump himself that is causing these problems. I think he's identified them and put them on the agenda for discussion and solution. But these are things that are going to be central issues in the transatlantic relationship beyond those security and geopolitical issues.
Thank you, George. I think you touched upon a lot of the questions which I would have following on, but I would like to give the floor now to Leslie, and I would also like to remind you that you should keep your remarks under 5 minutes so we have enough time for some questions from the audience as well. Please, Leslie.
So the question is about the sources of trouble in the transatlantic relationship?
Yes, and is it Trump or is it a more seismic shift, which will, even if it's a Democratic president, American and European relationship will be different?
Thanks. I'll keep it short. Okay, so we heard from you, we've heard, as I gather last night, from the famous John Mearsheimer, once my professor in various shapes and forms. And we know, I think, all of us who pay attention to international affairs, that you cannot understate the significance of the structural logic of international relations, the rise of China, the rivalry between the US and China, and a degree of inevitability about that and what it means for Europe. The story about Donald Trump's rise, I think, is well told. And the sort of structural argument behind that, America's loss of its manufacturing base, its, its MAGA base, its sort of high school educated white men who aren't employed in the way that they need to be employed in order to enjoy a life that keeps them from being susceptible to a certain kind of political mobilization, which isn't necessarily in the greater good. And has created a lot of toxic politics. And of course, it's not just that. It's sort of layered on people's interests in deregulation and tax cuts and, all sorts of things. The story's really well told, and there's a kind of structural geopolitical story, and there's a Trump domestic economic story. And of course, they're integrally linked. But I'm one of those few people who actually doesn't think it's just structural. I think that the US president, our president, my president, is unique and distinctive and singular, and that I don't think you can just, one individual is not the same as every other individual. So it does matter, actually, who we elect and who leads, and there's kind of a space there for having influence. Not any US president, despite this great geopolitical moment in which we live, would have a strong affinity for an economic policy that put tariffs as the chief tool of influence in this particular moment. It's not obviously something that flows from the geopolitical circumstances, and it's definitely one of the things that is having the most significant impact in this moment on how Europeans are grappling with the American problem. It's not only the Ukraine question, the Euro-Atlantic security and NATO question, it's also a question about the fundamentals in the economic relationship, and it is a question about values and democracy. So I think that so in this sense, I think that some of the questions actually that the organizers put on the agenda are really important ones. And I do think that very difficult to talk about Europe. Europe is not aligned or integrated. It's divided. There's an effort to make Europe speak with one voice. I live in the UK. I'm never sure if that's Europe or not, nor are they. And it's an empirical question, and it's a policy question at the moment, as we know. But so therefore, hard to talk about Europe and the US. B, very difficult to predict exactly where Europe goes below the headline. Yes, less relevant on the big geopolitical questions. We hear many people say that Europe is less relevant to the US will shift its focus towards China. But if you actually look at much of what's going on, the US is actually spending a lot of time in the Middle East. Not obvious that that follows from a structural logic of international politics, but I understand the argument that there might be a price to be paid for not following that logic. So the transatlantic relationship clearly is being affected by the structural overtone and underpinnings, but it also is being very much influenced by the election of Donald Trump in the context where in the majority of European nations, the liberal elite establishment that has driven foreign policy conversations is not happy with the current tenor that's coming from the United States. That inevitably will affect the choices that Europe makes, that European leaders are able to easily make when they have domestic publics that are alienated by the rhetoric that's coming out of the US. It makes it harder for leaders to move politics in one direction, maybe easier for them to move in another direction. And then I guess I'll just sort of say, as a closing point, but we'll come back, I assume, to many of these questions. Many people also put the hypothesis on the table, or the argument on the table, that inevitably, in this moment, where Donald Trump is alienating an antagonistic force towards the liberal establishment, such as it exists in much of, but not all of Europe, that Europe will therefore singularly lean into China. I also think that there's no evidence for this right now. Europe is all over the map on what it intends to do with its relationship towards China. And clearly, much of this is completely linked because it's driven by declining growth rates in Europe, some of which is a product of demographics, technological policy, and some of which is a product of not structural logics, but Donald Trump's trade and tariffs policy, which will make Europe's growth problems much more difficult if they're executed on at a time when Europe is supposed to be increasing its defense spending. So these are like phenomenally complex problems, and structure tells us a lot, but there's a whole lot that it doesn't actually tell us.
Thank you, Leslie. Although I'm a realist, I tend to agree that personalities matter. So I think in this sense, Trump matters as well. I think the First World War could have been very differently if there's not Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany. So I think personalities can matter. But I will give the floor now to Philip. Before the panel, we actually talked about this question, and I think he has a very historic perspective on this. So please, the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you to the host for inviting me here. It's always a great pleasure as an American, even if you come to Europe often, to come to this great city on the Danube and its tradition, so thank you for that. I will disagree with my distinguished colleague on the left here. Donald Trump, despite his bluster, despite his personal style, which is unique, he is nevertheless very much in a tradition of American foreign policy, a conservative American foreign policy. That conservatism goes back to distinguished American conservative Republican leaders such as Senator Bob Taft, even Herbert Hoover, Calvin Coolidge. Trump is very much in that tradition. This involves tariffs, this involves anti-immigration, this involves the national interest as the first determination of U.S. engagement in the world. It even involves when the United States is attacked, and you see this right now in the discussions in the Middle East, Trump's language, we're not involved, he says, don't hit us. But if you hit us, we will hit you back enormously. So you think to the situation in Pearl Harbor in 1941, when the America First Committee, a huge strain in American foreign policy traditions that the Europeans, particularly those in Brussels, need to go back and renew their understanding of those traditions. After the bombing of the Japanese in 1941, that flipped immediately with the America First movement, which Donald Trump very much is the modern expression of, to engage in the war. But I believe the answer for our European friends to understand, particularly those in Brussels, is that the so-called Trump phenomenon is an expression deep in American foreign policy traditions, going back, as I say, probably to a reaction to Woodrow Wilson and the First World War. The great American thinker, foreign policy thinker, Dr. Henry Kissinger, set up in one of his great books on diplomacy, set up a competition between the Roosevelt Republicans and the Wilson Democrats, Wilsonianism versus Teddy Roosevelt. Those are two traditions, but who am I to correct Dr. Kissinger? He overlooked the tradition that was carried out from Calvin Coolidge to Herbert Hoover to Bob Taft about another vision of what the Republican Party, what American conservatism should be doing when it engaged in the world. And again, that goes very much back to tariffs, no immigration, and a policy first defined what is the U.S. national interest. So I hope our friends in Brussels take good notes on that. There is a long history. It is very much coming back into the dominance of U.S. foreign policy out of Washington.
Thank you, Philip. Well, I'm hopeful, but sadly some of our friends in the European Union don't even know what is a man and a woman, so I have a bit of doubt as well. But I will give the floor now to Professor István Stumpf to give the Hungarian and European view on the question.
Yeah, historically speaking, I think the whole transatlantic relationship very much based on the Pax Americana, the unipolar or bipolar world, this is over. The liberal world order is over. But not the history, but just the liberal world order is over. And I think there is the huge competition who is going to reframe that kind of liberal world order, not just the economical competition and political competition, but the competition among the visions. Who has the clear idea about how could frame that kind of new situation? And I think it has very clear that the Europe in this competition is not in the first period, because in Europe, in the middle of identity crisis, the pro-war European leadership not able to understand those kind of language which the Trump administration is speaking. And I think they are very much based on that kind of big bureaucracy which behind the European leadership. It's very much similar than the deep state in the United States. So they are doing several decisions without any legitimation. And this is the consequence, that they are not able to understand what the nation-state leader is going to speak about that. And I hope that we could find a way how could the European leadership and the American leadership talk together and could make some kind of common vision about the world. Because if they are not able to do that, the new player, I think they are very important player, India and also the global south, and especially China and the Russian Empire, they are also would like to get some kind of part of the big cake. And if we are not going to be very careful, and then we are losing our future vision, which based on our history, the tradition. Europe has a great history, and I think this history very much the very colorful history, and it has the great experience. Why we not use this one? But we have to base on our tradition and our history as well, if we would like to be a leader of the world.
Thank you, Professor. It was already kind of partly mentioned by George and Leslie as well, with changes in manufacturing and some of the I would say dissident kind of fears coming from different parts of population, which has changed American politics. Now, I think if this is the case in America, this should be double the case in Europe. So I think if you look at countries like Ireland or the UK, manufacturing has almost completely kind of disappeared. So my question really is here, and I will start with Leslie to give the UK view on this, is will this lead to change in Europe as well? So will we see different parties strengthening in Europe? A lot of people, I think, thought that some of the more populist right-wing parties in Europe can have a shift by Trump's election. As you know, if Trump can do it, why can't we do it in Europe as well? But of course, you might have the Canadian and partly Australian counter-argument there. You know, it seems that Trump might have actually helped the more liberal parties to win instead of the conservatives. And the tariff war could have a similar effect here in Europe as well. But you might have, let's say, more nationalistic parties who sympathize with Trump, but because the tariffs are hurting their own country, will have to kind of distance themselves from Trump as well. So what is your opinion? What will this lead in Europe? Will we see a raise in kind of different parties? Will we have a tension? And I'm also kind of starting with the UK, because I think Keir Starmer's government has kind of, for the time being, surprisingly handled Trump fairly well. So it seems that you have some form of economic deal. And Farage is very friendly with Trump. So it's kind of a very strange situation. Please let me know what you think.
I mean, it's very hard to look into the future on the UK, because the UK is in a very difficult position right now, obviously trying to reset, for the first time, taking seriously trying to reset its relationship with Europe at the same time that it is trying to manage in a pretty nuanced way, keeping the US aligned or in not only Europe, but keeping that relationship with the UK very strong. And in the context of a relatively new UK government, in which the economy is in a very difficult place, growth is low, the ambition, the enthusiasm for this new leadership, Keir Starmer and his government, and that they could sort of really get Britain back on a strong course economically, has been considerably dampened. So it's certainly, all of those things come together and certainly create an opening for the Reform Party, which I think is, for many people, one of the key questions, for many people, one of the key concerns. But now that Britain has set elections, that ball has been kicked down the road considerably. So it's very difficult, just in terms of who actually, not who has influence. Clearly, there is a fair amount of popular support and influence for the Reform Party, but who actually governs, that is a question that has been kicked way into the future. And the number of known unknowns that will take place between now and the next UK election are considerable. But then if you sort of add on the level of uncertainty geopolitically, technologically, and therefore in terms of kind of growth, it's very difficult to see into the future. I've had one colleague, well-placed, say that they can imagine a scenario. I'm not saying that one should give this credibility, but it was a credible person, that they can imagine a scenario in which the next election leads to Boris Johnson coming back into the leadership of the Conservative Party and going into coalition with the Reform government with Nigel Farage or somebody at the top. I mean, look, it's a long way. It's a long way to an election, let alone that kind of outcome. But absent delivering on the many promises and the deep need, if you turn up to London, as I'm sure many of you do, it's a very good life in the center. But move outside of London, take the train, and you are in an altered reality pretty darn quickly in terms of how people are actually living, the growth, the conditions for daily life. So the ground is there for a repositioning of national politics, and the U.S. economic policy is not set up to help right now. But there's a lot of room for movement.
Thank you, Leslie. I will turn now to Professor Stumpf to give the kind of the European, again, Hungarian view on this, and perhaps also to talk about how could this affect the Patriots Party group in the European Parliament.
I just came back from Poland. I participated Lawyers for Rule of Law conference organized by the Polish Constitutional Court, and it was very interesting to see that the Tusk government, which very much committed to rebuild the rule of law society, regularly and systematically violating the rule of law regulations, especially regarding with the constitutional issues. Yes, I think the patriotic fraction, which was last year, it was established very much based on the initiation of Orbán Viktor and Babiš. I think this is representing the hope, representing that we are able to defend the traditional values, the free speech, and also the family issues, and not very much focusing on the united Europe, which is, I think, the only issue of the leadership in Brussels. So that's unacceptable that not elected people decided about the future of Europe. And they are, I think, destroying the common sense way of thinking, especially if we are talking about the war, especially if we are talking about the role of Russia in the future of Europe and in the future of the global world order. And I hope that those kind of political power and political player in Czech Republic, Babiš, and also in Slovakia and Hungary and Serbia, they have got enough popular support to stop that kind of non-rational thinking and that kind of things against the common sense. I hope that we could do that, and the patriotic faction could play a very important role.
Thank you, Professor. I'm hopeful as well. So I'm obviously biased if you look at my socks. So I'm hopeful that Trump will kind of have shockwaves to Europe as well. But I'm interested now in the American view, and I will give the floor to Philip. What do you think? How could this affect the European party families?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch it.
But how will the election of Trump will affect European politics? Do you think there's going to be a strengthening of the more populist national parties, or?
Yes, I think we are in a transitional time with regard to these parties and some of the thinking, and maybe the United States, with the re-election of Donald Trump, has revisited some of these values that are in conflict in Europe, particularly between the elite leadership in Brussels and the nation states across this great continent. Abraham Lincoln had a great message for his generation in the United States, which was the Americans needed to disenthrall themselves from dogmas of the past. A great expression from a great president, disenthrall themselves from dogmas of the past. I think we are doing that in the United States with the election of Trump, despite all of the machinery that was used to prevent that election. It did happen. It is a turning point on some of the value structures. Americans, I believe, and this is probably true of President Trump as well, have great respect for the great traditions of Europe. We have perhaps less respect for the dogmas that are dominant in Brussels, these dogmas that cut across issues like the woke agenda basket of issues, like the treatment of energy production, like questions of immigration. These issues, I think, in the United States we have advanced on and are coming to a new place. It's a very pragmatic, Calvin Coolidge sense, a very pragmatic version of how to run a country. It is different than what I understand as an American is the dominant orthodoxy coming out of Brussels. So perhaps the American experience may give support, moral support, such as it is, to parties and other movements in Europe that are challenging these orthodoxies, these dogmas, and the Europeans themselves can disenthrall themselves of the dogmas of the past.
Well, I hope you're right, and that's why I think actually G.D. Vance's speech helped, despite a lot of Europeans think. But I will now give the floor to George to kind of comment on this question as well. Do you think this can lead to changes in the European politics?
Well, I think the answer flows from a simple truism: success breeds success. Donald Trump has identified problems that other people were unwilling to articulate explicitly and said, these are real problems, we have to solve them. And I think that resonates with certainly parts of Europe that struggle with not dissimilar problems and are probably encouraged that someone has said, hey, these are problems and we need to address them. But now we're in a position where Trump has won this election, he is in power, he has to actually solve problems that he's identified. And the degree to which this becomes contagious in Europe and paves the way toward greater power from parts of the European political spectrum that share Trump's vision and his identification of the problems we're facing, I think that's going to depend on how successful he is in addressing some of these key problems. And I think matters of war and peace are central to this. He came into power saying he was going to settle this war in Ukraine, that his approach to the world is going to be that of peacemaker. Well, now he's in a position where he's going to have to deliver. Can he steer these conflicts away from escalation towards diplomatic settlements or not? If he's unsuccessful in doing that, I think that's going to tarnish the brand. It's going to have a lasting impact on how his agenda is perceived, and I don't think that will help like-minded parties in Europe. If he does demonstrate success in this area, that probably raises the chances that some like-minded successor will be elected in the United States. J.D. Vance comes to mind as one possibility. The economic thing is also critical. I think President Trump is of the opinion that the European Union as a trade bloc has actually been a problem for the U.S. economy, a problem for his vision of how to restructure the American economy such that it is not based on buying other countries' manufactured goods on credit. If he is successful in negotiating what he would call a more equitable terms of trade with the European Union, with China, with others, that in turn, I think, will increase the chances that he will be perceived as successful and that this model may have some legs going into the future and beyond American borders.
Of course, please, Leslie.
Yeah, I mean, I think already one thing that we're seeing is that, certainly in the UK and elsewhere, is that the sort of moderate middle parties are tacking to the right. And that is a direct response, I would argue, not only towards our own domestic politics, but towards the climate and the messaging that's coming out of the Trump administration. So look at Keir Starmer on immigration, right? The concerns about immigration have been there, but the sort of movement is clearly designed to ward off, domestic political threats, so that we do understand that there is already a change. But ultimately, sure, there are some voters that are sticky, that they're going to be where they're going to be no matter what. But most voters aren't voting on the big geopolitical issues. They're voting on inflation, prices, how it affects their daily life. If these parties, whether they're mainstream, far right, whatever they are, if they do not deliver, they will pay a price at the ballot box, and that includes President Trump. And right now, you might say he has a certain kind of narrative and it has a tradition, but actually we know by looking at his coalition that there are multiple policies in there, and we're always kind of waiting to see where the president is going to come down. So it's not just more of the same. There has been a change. It's a complex moment in the U.S. But if growth comes down, as it is predicted to, if we get more inflation, if we were to get a recession, then there will be a price to be paid. And people are watching that, right? They're voting on their own domestic circumstances, but they are observing what is taking place, and it will have an impact. It will have an impact not only for people, but for leaders. Is what he's doing going to work? Can we mimic it and do the same and have a similar result?
Thank you. That's a very important point you made. I think, yes, people do care at the bread and butter issues in the end of the day. But also, I agree that I think, at least on rhetoric, a lot of things have shifted, especially on migration. So things people are saying now, let's say Viktor Orban said 10 years ago, but then, they were saying, how can you say these things? And now a lot of the mainstream European parties are saying the same. Of course, we're not saying we're saying what Viktor Orban said 10 years ago, but you can hear that there's a very similar rhetoric. This is going to be my last question, and I hope that afterwards we will have one or two audience questions as well. But it was already mentioned, especially by you, George, kind of how Europe has to step up in burden sharing, of course, in spending more on defense, but also in diplomacy, kind of solving some of the issues, especially surrounding Europe. So as a European, I sometimes feel kind of embarrassed. They cannot even keep peace on the Balkans. It looks like. So it's true that I think there's a very valid, I would say, vision coming from America that Europe has to step up. It has to do more for its defense. So my question is going to go first to Professor Stumpf, because he's the European at the panel. But how do you see, do you think that Europe will step up? And what do you think of European strategic autonomy? European strategic autonomy. Do you think that Europe can step up and kind of be a stronger partner to America by actually developing some of it? Because this is kind of an ongoing debate. Even in Europe, some are saying that, that will be a threat to NATO. I personally think it will not be a threat. So even as a European common army, if we're spending much more on defense, I think that helps America because they can focus on other issues, but also we're going to be far more important allies. But of course, this is debated, and I'm kind of interested to know how you see that, Professor. But do you think that Europe will step up? And what do you think of European strategic autonomy?
First of all, we have to finish the war. I think if we are just spending so much money supporting the war without the future plan, what we would like to create a new independent European army or independent Ukrainian army, which is going to save Europe, or this will be the place where the people fighting each other as a proxy war or something like that. So I think until we are not able to agree in this basic issue, it will be very hard to think about the economical development. Yes, the German very much realized that they have to do something, because if they are not going to revitalize the economy, I think it could cost not just Germany, but the whole Europe as well. But it's not just the only way how to support the military industry. If we are just focusing on the military industry, this is the disaster. That's my opinion. There are several very good ideas how to focus on the artificial intelligence. We have tradition in the innovation. We have to focusing on the space business as well. So there are several alternative ways we have to support the science and the research. And we have a tradition to several Nobel Prize winner people came from Hungary and came from the European. So the knowledge-based society is much more important than the military-based society. So I would like to focus on, if the Europe is able to change that kind of way of thinking, I think it could help the other. But you have to base on the different nation-state sources, intellectual and other sources. And we have to cooperate, and we have to go back the founding father ideas that Europe trying to keep the independence of the national states.
Thank you. I would now ask George, what is the American view on this? And also, can you kind of let us know what Europe should do to be a better friend to America?
Well, I think this is a big unknown right now. Europe has to step up, yes. Can it step up? That's another matter. Stepping up is not just spending more money on defense, as I mentioned. Part of being a pole in this emerging multipolar order, having weight and influence in the world to establish a balance of power, is to be self-confident, is to be spiritually healthy. And this was one of the things that the United States tried to do in the aftermath of World War II. Europe was physically destroyed, it was economically devastated, but it was also spiritually in a very bad place. And by that I mean its spirit. And so the question that Europe faces right now is, can it build a sense of purpose, a vision of the future and of its role in the world that is positive, that attracts support inside Europe, as opposed to a vision of unity that is based on fear, fear of Russia, fear of opposition, fear of disinformation. Those are not ingredients, in my opinion, for a strong Europe that's not just economically and militarily vibrant, but has a sense of purpose and vision that invigorates. So that's a fundamental question. It's not one that the United States can answer, but I think that's part of what J.D. Vance was getting at in his speech at Munich. We need Europe to be strong, and Europe will not be strong if it lives in fear of Russians under every chair, of disinformants that are poisoning people's minds and attitudes. And that is an open question right now.
Thank you. That was a very important point. I will turn now to Leslie to kind of give the American-UK view on this, especially that I think the UK was, while they were still in the European Union, one of the biggest enemies for the European Common Army. I think they were really kind of the country which was looking at, this could replace NATO, although I don't think anybody said that. So how does this look from the UK? The European Common Army, European strategic autonomy, it's usually the French we associate this and not the British.
I mean, I don't think the UK has any interest in European strategic autonomy per se. I think the UK is completely bought on to the necessity of spending more in defense, ideally not just by buying America, but by creating a jobs-based defense industrial investment strategy. It's clear that the message has been delivered, it has been received, it's still extremely hard to execute on, because if you look across the whole of the UK's government services, transportation, the NHS, the list is long, education, things are fraying at the edges, they're hollowing out in the middle. It's a really hard case to make. to do a whole lot more in defense, and yet they're actually trying to do it. But, you know, as we know, there's a long catch-up game, and it takes a lot of time. And at the same time, again, go back to, can you get your growth rate up? Can you innovate? Can you be attractive place for investment? And what is it going to take to do that? You know, can you, now that you don't have Huawei because, you know, you ceded the ground on the China debate with the United States back in Trump 1.0 and when Boris Johnson was in place, all those things that have made it, you know, maybe they were the right decision, maybe they weren't, but have made it even harder. It's going to be hard to deliver on the doing what the U.S. is asking and, quite frankly, what the Brits absolutely know they need to do. They're not standing up saying they don't want to do it. They recognize the British are phenomenally good at self-awareness. They, unlike we Americans, right, they recognize and talk about their deficits. And they recognize the problems with the daily conditions of those who are recruited into the Army, the number of people that are leaving on a very regular basis being much higher than the number of people that are being recruiting. They get this in spades, they recognize the problem, but there is a big difference between recognizing the problem and delivering on the solution. And the solution at this point has not been, unlike in certain parts of Europe, to say, oh, the solution is, you know, just to go hard on Europe's strategic autonomy. As we know, the UK, for whatever reason, absolutely wants the relationship with the US to be top and wants the US to stay in and recognizes the reality, but is certainly trying to push back against it. Whether that's kicking the can down the road or just trying to wait out Donald Trump, I think there's a recognition that America has changed its line and it's not going back, but there's still kind of wishful thinking at some level that maybe, you know, maybe things will stabilize, but there's really very little evidence to suggest that. So it's a tough moment in the UK, I would say.
I tend to agree. But I would like to ask Philip to give his 2 cents on this as well.
From the American perspective, perhaps the Europeans have put too much in the illusion that Brussels, that Europe can solve problems for them. On the security question, I would be encouraged if the great states of Europe went back to creating their own national military capacities and made them conventional forces that played a role in the security of Europe in a way that they haven't done since the Cold War. If you're of a certain age, you can remember going to the old West Germany and seeing a huge commitment for the national defense. To be sure, it was the Cold War era, but we are in another era in which the great countries of Europe, as I think sometimes we see here in Hungary, the great countries of Europe need to build conventional military capacities and then coordinate among themselves, as opposed to wishfully thinking that something can be done on the European level.
Thank you. And I think we have still a bit of time for, let's say, 2 questions. There's a gentleman there who's been trying to get our attention for a time, so we'll give him, I would just really want to ask you to make a question, not a comment, and try to keep it short.
Thank you. I will. Evgeny Preherman, Minzdala Council on International Relations in Belarus. Given the centrality of collective security to the entire transatlantic relationship, I'm wondering why we haven't had a discussion about NATO so far. So a quick question to all panelists. Where do you see NATO at around the time when President Trump's presidential term will end?
I think we'll get a second question for somebody quickly. Yes, well, I'm not sure who said first, but perhaps the gentleman here in the front.
I was a British diplomat for 24 years, and interesting to get the UK and the US perspective from 2 Americans. Sorry for the comment. But my question is about Europe. How can you deliver less is more? Because actually Europe's big problem is it's held back by the limitations of collective decision making. Really. So how, you know, picking on Professor Stump's sort of thesis about the loss of sovereignty, how can you sort of retool and downsize the European institutions so that the community as a whole can work together lose less sovereignty and have greater impact on the world stage?
Thank you. So the first question about NATO, I'm not sure who wants to. George, you would like to take the floor on NATO?
Sure. NATO once had a purpose during the Cold War. That purpose was to serve as a military and security counterbalance against the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact. It fulfilled that purpose quite well. Obviously, in retrospect, once that Cold War ended, the question was, what was NATO going to be? And NATO decided at the time, we need to expand, we need to go out of area. If we don't expand and go out of area, what are we for? We don't have a purpose anymore. But that period of NATO's development is over. It cannot continue to expand. It cannot continue to go out of area. It has reached the point where continuing that process actually endangers the security of members of the alliance. So NATO has to change, and the question is, how does it manage this change? What is its vision for its future purpose? I would argue that NATO needs to focus on defense of its existing allies. And it needs to focus on negotiating a new arrangement, a balance of power, a set of rules of the game that will govern its relationship with Russia primarily, so that that relationship does not veer into outright military conflict, which it is in danger of doing and has been in danger of sliding into for several years now. And that question is still not over. We're still wrestling with those prospects. But now, within the alliance, there's going to have to be a changing balance. We've talked about that a lot. I don't think that new balance within the relationship within the NATO alliance is possible if the United States does not work with our European allies to manage the transition. If the United States simply wipes its hands and says, too hard, over to you, Europe, you figure out how to deal with this, I think we're likely headed toward failure and a break in the transatlantic relationship that will be very disruptive and counterproductive. Now, the question is, are the European parts of this alliance and the United States ready to talk about managing that transition and making it as smooth and harmonious as possible? That question, I think, remains to be answered.
I'm very sorry, but I got a very strong signal from the organizers that we have to wrap it up because of the delay in the former panel. So I'm very sorry we cannot answer the second question, but I'm pretty sure that panelists are going to be here during some of the breaks, so hopefully you can ask them in person. So please join me in thanking our panelists, Professor Stumpf, Philip, Leslie, George. Thank you for being with us and sharing your insights on this very important topic. Thank you very much.